Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to share with you 5 tips to build a successful DBT project. So DBT, as we know, is open source and purposely designed to be very flexible. But with great power of choice comes great responsibility, and if you're not careful, your project can get out of hand pretty quickly. Let's get started with tip number 1, which is create a staging layer. So at a high level, the staging layer should contain cleaned up versions of your raw tables. And each staging model should ideally match one-to-one with each raw table that you have and then be used in place of it later on in your DBT project. So yes, that means that there will likely be a lot of them, and that's perfectly okay, as we'll touch on in a later tip. Example transforms at this level would include renaming columns, data type casting, simple conditional statements, but that's just to name a few. So you might be thinking, all right, that's fine, but why would we do this in the first place? Well, first, this embraces the concept of modularity. So rather than having the same source column transformed in different places and possibly in completely different ways, we can set it once so that it's consistent throughout the entire project. This also makes future maintenance much easier because you won't have to make just very simple updates in multiple places. It can all be done at that staging layer. Second, it acts as a gatekeeper for the rest of your project as well. Let's say you always know you're going to have to filter out certain data from a particular source. You can add that condition to your staging model and then be able to clearly see what's being excluded and know that it's being excluded from the start. So in summary, creating this staging layer, one that embraces the concept of modularity and acts as a clean starting point for the rest of your project, will help you get on the right path to building a successful DBT project. All right, so tip number 2 is to use CTEs, aka common table expressions. In another one of my videos on SQL tips, I talk a lot about using CTEs for organization. And this concept also holds true for DBT. By using CTEs, you can group your transformation logic, this custom business logic, into smaller pieces and then rename them with an alias. This is much cleaner than one extremely long and overly complex select statement. You can also use CTEs as imports in a similar fashion as you might see in some other software development practices. Maybe you're familiar with how that works in Python. This particular article was written by the folks at DBT Labs and actually proves that on modern data platforms, there's little to no performance hit for running a select star in a CTE. Instead, it'll actually act as a pass-through, and the query engines are smart enough to only use what's needed. Now, the implications of this are actually really important because it enables us to use CTEs to bring in basically any model that we want and just add it as a CTE using this select star. And doing it this way will give us access to every underlying column without needing to actually list them out, and it's not going to crush our performance either. And finally, by grouping logic into CTEs, it allows you to easily troubleshoot by just changing what you select from at the end of your query. And again, this is because CTEs will operate as a pass-through unless you actually select something from it. Overall, you should make it a practice to structure your DBT queries something along the lines of this. Bring in the models you need as import CTEs. Next, create CTEs to group custom transformations. Create a final CTE where you select the final columns that you want for that particular model you're building. And then finally, finish with a select star from the final CTE. This select from the final CTE can then be adjusted for troubleshooting the different CTEs in your query, as mentioned. So all of this is possible by taking full advantage of the power of CTEs, and I've now said CTE way too many times. Okay, tip number 3 is to make use of directories. Aside from the obvious reasons of keeping yourself organized, there is a major benefit to your DBT specific workflow by implementing directories. Most importantly, you can set directory specific configurations within your dbt project.yaml file. This is by design to avoid repeating configurations across all models in a directory. So let's say, for example, all of your models in a staging directory will use the same custom schema. You don't have to set it in each individual one. You can set it once at the directory level, and that will flow through to all models within it. And then subdirectories could be given additional configurations, so on and so forth. Finally, you can also run models by directory. You can select those resources by just selecting from a directory path. So directories are a really important part of DBT and allow you to follow dry don't repeat yourself, these type of principles. And don't be afraid of a lot of them in your project. Sometimes people get a little tripped up. They open up a lot of options and don't cost anything to add them. Tip number 4 is to create a style guide. As with any team project, naming and consistency is super important, and this is especially true with DBT. As developers, obviously, we would love to have unlimited creative freedom, do whatever we want, but the reality is keeping everyone aligned enables a lot of efficiencies. For example, in how you develop, in your code reviews, and onboarding new team members to your project to work with you. DBT projects can grow really quickly, and having an agreed upon style should probably be one of the first things you decide as a team. And some of the examples of these type of conventions could include how you want to name your columns. So maybe camel versus snake case, plural versus singular model naming, other naming standards like whether you prefix your models with a certain convention, things like that. There's a lot more, but by deciding it, it'll save you a lot of time and allow you to be more efficient. One suggestion is to add this guide within your README directly in your project. And that way it's front and center, and everyone can see it as they're working with your project. Here's an example guide from DBT Labs that they give as an example starting point. So we can see what they have here. And at the end of the day, nobody likes extra documentation, but in this case, I'd still recommend it. Now, lastly, but certainly not least, for tip number 5 is don't optimize for fewer lines. In one of the trainings I attended a couple years ago, there was a great quote that was shared, which was something along the lines of, "New lines are cheap, brain power is expensive." We all love to challenge ourselves, to write the most optimized code possible. And it can certainly be rewarding to find ways to simplify your syntax and how something is written. But when the next person comes along, looks at this code, it's going to take them a lot of time to retrace your steps. Even with a lot of great comments, it can still take a lot of time for someone to pick this up, which then takes that brain power away from possibly more productive activities. And not to mention, this time of somebody else doing this does have a very real cost. And so ultimately, while you certainly don't want to be lazy with your code, you also don't want to over-engineer a solution to the point where quite literally nobody else is going to understand it. Just keep that in mind. And this concept of brain power also comes in play in terms of readability. Doing things like trying to remove white space, line breaks, just to keep your query with fewer lines doesn't really provide any real benefits. If you think about it, there's essentially no cost to breaking logic into multiple lines for better readability, or adding an extra space to a join just to see it maybe a little more clearly. So next time you're building out a DBT model, remember, extra lines are cheap, but brain power is expensive. DBT at the end of the day is a great tool, but one that requires a lot of diligence and planning to be most effective. So I hope you found these tips helpful. If you have other ones that you've found helpful as well, leave them as a comment and share them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.